Shalom from Jerusalem. In our week's Parsha, Tetzavah, it is actually a continuation for what we learned last week. Last week, we learned the commandment of building a house for the mighty one of Jacob, a tabernacle. The tabernacle throughout the generations would turn into the temple. As we know, the tabernacle journeyed with the Jewish people for the 40 years that the Jewish people traveled throughout the desert. It entered into the land of Israel with them, and eventually was established hundreds of years later by King Solomon on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In this week's Parsha, we are taught about the special garments which the priests wore when they worked in the service of God. Now, the priests who come from the tribe of Levites wasn't always in the original plan of God to be the ones who would work in the service of God. Originally, God wanted the eldest of each family to work, but because of the sin of the golden calf, that was changed. And the ones who stood up for God's honor were only from the tribe of Levite. And so they were chosen, part of the tribe of Levite, the Kohanim, the priests, to work in the service of God. Now, how much splendor is there in the garments themselves, which are brought down in our weekly portion? 4 garments were worn by the regular priests, and 8 garments by the high priests. Each garment had special qualities that they could actually bring down atonement for the Jewish people themselves. What a perfect world, a perfect temple that God made for us. For instance, we learn out in the Talmud, why is it that the chapter which talks about the sacrifices brought down in the Torah right next to the garments worn by the priests? In order to teach us the very important lesson that just as the sacrifices in the temple atoned, so too did the garments themselves atone. They had that special quality. For instance, we learn in the Talmud how the avnet, the belt worn by the Kohanim, a very special belt, which was 32 amot, that means that it was 16 meters. Very, very long. That atoned for bad thoughts because it was worn over the heart. A priest working in the temple would wear it over his heart. And he wouldn't be able to run with it. He'd have to go slowly, always thinking proper thoughts in the service of God. The pants, for instance, that the priests wore, that atoned for murders. The me'il, the coat worn by the priests, atoned for bad speech, speaking lashon hara, speaking poorly, badly against a fellow Jew. And so on and so forth. The Talmud comes down and teaches us that each garment had that very special quality, that quality to atone. How great was the service of God, and how much it pains us today that that is what is missing. And we unfortunately don't understand. We, or the nations of the world. The Midrash brings out that if the nations of the world would have known what benefit it was to the entire world when the service of the temple stood in Jerusalem, they would have sent their biggest armies in order to protect the temple itself. The Marines would have been sent over here in order to make sure that the service continues, because the benefit to the world would be tremendous. Unfortunately, that is no more. We say on the Yom Kippur service, the most holiest day, how happy is the eye who saw the high priest enter with his garments into the Holy of Holies and doing the service. But oh, that is no more. It pains us greatly that the service of the temple is no more, and the garments and the beautiful splendor of the Jews is no more. And unfortunately, because of our great sins and the long length of the exile for almost 2,000 years, we don't even know what's missing today. That's the real tragedy. That's what I'm talking about. And so we find in one of the weekly Torah sheets that has been distributed, a call to Jews to come in order to learn Talmud at, what's it called? The most holiest site in the world for the Jews. And what is that? On the Western Wall. That's really, you could rip your garments from anguish when someone reads about that. The most holiest site for the Jewish people is not the Western Wall. The Western Wall is an outer wall, a retaining wall of the Mount Moriah. It wasn't even a wall of the mountain itself, of the temple itself. It had absolutely nothing to do with the temple. It was a retaining wall. And because the Jewish people were not permitted to go up to the Temple Mount because of the laws of the ruling people, the ruling governments who ruled over here, so they made the second best thing, and that was to pray to God to rebuild the temple in the place closest that they were able to get to. But it's a far cry to say that that is the most important site for the Jewish people. No, that is not correct. The most important site for the Jewish people is, of course, the Temple Mount. The temple where the temple stood. And that is what we must look for and long for and hope for and go up to pray for. The Temple Mount on top. The Kotel was good during the long length of the exile, when that was the only place that was permitted for Jews to go. But it is a far cry from the real thing. That's what our lesson is today from the Parsha. As we read about the splendor of these garments worn by the priests and the high priests, and the greatness and the atonement that that brought down for the Jewish people of the entire world, we long for those days. It should cause us anguish. It should pain us that that is missing today. Each and every person, each and every Jew should have a pain in his heart because the temple is no more. And our longing should be for the rebuilding of God's house, the mighty one of Jacob. I'm Levi Chazan, and you're not. From Yeshivat Rayon HaYehudi in Yerushalayim.